Right, and this question comes from Traveller.
Hi, Traveller.
Traveller says, what insights into narcissism can we learn from the Jungian model?
Right, thank you, Traveller. Freud was very big on narcissism. It formed a significant chunk of his approach. Less so with Jung, who tended to follow Freud up to a point and then diversify into his own interests. In a clinical setting, I don't actually think that either of them give you the optimal approach to dealing with narcissism. Narcissism is defined differently according to the different schools of therapy and to the different diagnostic sources that you might go to. So really you'd have to resolve down for yourself precisely what you mean in a specific context by narcissism. But I would take it to be a personality disorder or a disorder of character, and in that sense it's more likely to be genetic in origin than anything else. The psychosocial elements are where all the problems are caused, because narcissists seldom trouble themselves, they trouble other people. So I would say that from my perspective clinically, I find myself dealing with the effects of narcissism on other people. Narcissists themselves are extremely resilient to any kind of positive therapeutic change, although one, I guess, interesting Jungian insight you can get from them is the very curious phenomenon that their shadow is the complete polar opposite to what it is for normal people. For example, you will find that normal people will become embarrassed when their shadow slips out, and then they realise that they have metaphorically become beside themselves, and they're shocked by that and they take it back in. With narcissists, however, they get very surprised when they do something that's decent, and they're embarrassed by it, and they do things like that now and again, and where it's not crafted deliberately to manipulate another person and they've been literally taken by surprise by their own shadow, you see the same degree of embarrassment with them for being nice than you do with a nice person for being not nice. So you do literally see that reversal of polarity of the shadow with narcissism from a Jungian perspective. It's almost amusing. If the narcissist wasn't such a toxic individual, it'd be something to frankly find yourself being amused by, because of the irony of the fact that their shadow is the total opposite. But in daily life observations, that's probably the clearest Jungian element that you can see. Their shadow is positive, whereas for most people it's considered to be negative.
This is one of the things with narcissism, is it's one of those diagnoses that's thrown around all over the place. Yeah. And we were talking behind the scenes recently, and you made some posts on the Jung To Live By Discord about narcissism involving anima projection as well. Yes. I was thinking that in terms of the Jungian model.
That's a good point.
Because you were saying narcissism is a personality disorder, but this is not. This is this other form, if you like, is a product of youth, or is a product of...
Thank you, James.
I think that'd be cool to go into it.
For reminding me of that. Yeah. This is connected deeply to the concept of the anima, and particularly the idea of falling in love with your anima projection onto another person. In some ways that is narcissistic, because, and this is worthy of a podcast all on its own, the anima is not a woman. It's projected onto a woman. It's part of male psychology. The reverse is also true. The animus is not a man. It's not an inner man in the same way that the anima is not an inner woman. The animus is part of a woman's psychology. It is therefore feminine psychology. This is probably difficult for some people to get their head around, because they're used to the way that Jungians normally refer to those constructs. But when a man projects his anima onto a woman, he is projecting a part of his own psychology onto the object of the other person. And what he falls in love with then is something that he's carrying within himself. And by conceiving of that relationship that he is aspiring to as something that completes him, that is, if you like, a kind of narcissism, in the sense that the Greeks understood it to be. It's a form of self-love which is projected onto the other. Now, beneath all of that, of course, we have Darwinistic and biological drives, which are unconscious and very, very powerful. But at a psychological level, it is an attempt to complete yourself through a form of self-love. So you could say, yeah, that's a Jungian form of narcissism in that sense. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
And we should discuss that in depth on another podcast.
We should do, on another day. Alright, and this question comes from a developer, and he says, Hi all, I hope you're having a good day. Now, Steve mentioned in an earlier podcast that Jung's statistics were deeply flawed, allowing some to debunk his work completely. To your knowledge, have there been any earnest inquiries with scientific thinking to study synchronicity with sound statistics? Thanks, double smiley face.
Yeah, thanks, developer. The whole field of parapsychology is contentious with respect to its statistical results. They're constantly under attack from skeptics. To my personal knowledge, there isn't anything definitive with respect to synchronicity as framed as synchronicity. But I would recommend that you look at John Ryan Hewell's book, Volume 2 of Jung for the 21st Century, where he's looking at the neurobiology of synchronicity, and that is definitely in the direction that depth psychology is moving towards the neurosciences. So I wouldn't worry too much about the statistical elements of it. It's experiential. That's the real proof of it is in the experience of it within its context. That's not something that's easily amenable to statistical analysis. But if you want to look at the theory, definitely look at John Ryan Hewell and his work. It's at the forefront of where Jungian psychology is going, despite the inertia from a lot of the classical Jungians. And John Ryan Hewell is a classical Jungian, but he's moving towards the more scientific end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that book arriving, actually.
Yeah, it's good. It's really good. Really, really good.
Comes with a nice front cover, a nice matte finish. It's nice. Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like it doesn't matter, and I don't really know how you'd go about validating it, because those early tests that Jung did, they look to be pretty decent to me in terms of like an experimental setup if it was legit. But as you've said before, it's been debunked. How else would you do it? I don't know. But anyone who's experienced a synchronicity, that turns out to be meaningful to them if they recognise it as such, such as ones with myself. And we've had weird ones related to the channel, actually. We have. Incredibly strange stuff.
We have. And paranormal.
Yeah,
as well.
Wasn't it the other day when we were filming something and you said the word dead? Don't do it now. But you said the word dead and the camera shut off.
Yeah, instantly, yeah. That kind of thing. And that was in a context which included a discussion on death and its wider implications and its meaning in a psychological sense. Yeah, I mean, I've said it before, but when you work in depth with depth psychology, there is a spike in the occurrence statistically of synchronicities, and if you ignore them, you don't take the hint, then the paranormal phenomenon starts as well. And I've taken that over the past 40 years to be an index of how deep you're going into a situation or a relationship psychotherapeutically with someone.
Yeah, it was before the most recent IPSA seminar. It was between the seminar and the social, I think, that we had the Zoom thing on, and Jane looked into the Zoom camera. Obviously, you can see behind you, and there was the ghost of a man. I was just doing whatever I was doing on my phone or whatever, and there was a ghost there. She's like, "Oh my God!" And I look up, and then she's like, "Oh my God, there was a man there. There was a man." I just closed the door. But like, I've had enough of this. I've had absolutely enough. It happens all the time.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It does. It's interesting. Always take it within its wider context. You'll probably find there's a lot going on in your own life as well. There's some activation of the unconscious which will be meaningful for you and for the people who are in relationship to you. So keep a weather eye open for these phenomena. Don't worry about statistical proofs either, because it just isn't amenable to that kind of analysis in the real world.
Yeah. Question comes from So To Speak. And So To Speak says, I'm 6 courses into my master's preparing to be a therapist in Texas. I've become very interested in analytical psychology and longer term therapy, but I also want to learn effective brief treatments so I can be relatively effective as soon as I start working. My idea was to get a great handle on something like solution-focused brief therapy as I stay on the long road reading existentialist and psychodynamic material. What advice can you professional or experienced folks offer? In other words, Steve.
Right, thank you. Yes, I understand where you're coming from on this. What I would say is think historically. The parents of psychotherapy are medicine and hypnosis, not psychology. Psychology you could consider to be, this is academic psychology, you could consider that to be the step parent of psychotherapy. But its real origins are in medicine and hypnosis. Hypnosis is not one approach, it is within itself as diverse as general psychotherapy is. In my experience, without question, it is, if you get the right training, the most effective brief form of therapy, bar none. Nothing can touch it. Whether that would satisfy you personally is another matter, and that's something for you to think about, but I would not be without it clinically at all. And when we train people at IPSA, their first year is taken up in learning clinical hypnosis, and in its application with respect to psychobiology, psychosocial issues, and also intrapsychic exploration, reframing, whatever you want to call it. So I would recommend, if you're asking me personally, definitely go and find yourself apex level hypnotherapy training. As for existentialism and psychodynamics, I suspect, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, that has more to do with personal development on your own part than it does with clinical efficacy. Existentialism is fine as a philosophy, and it's fine to help you develop a value set, but in my own experience, very, very few people would fit with that as a therapeutic model. There are existential psychotherapies. I'm familiar with a lot of the leading figures in it, personally familiar, within the UK anyway. So I would go towards apex level hypnotherapy and leave the rest for the moment for your own personal development.
Alright, and this question comes from Nightchild, and he asks, what is the role of typology in addressing a complex? Would you approach the same complex differently in two people of different types? Thank you. I was thinking about this. It might be fun for us to do a little role play. Of course, this will require you in the audience to understand typology to some degree anyway. Yeah. So myself, INTP. So if I came to you with a complex of some kind, and you could see the complex, you can see into my psyche, and I'm an INTP, how would the fact there was an INTP sort of play into that sort of therapeutic process that you'd want to enact on myself? Apart from the fact I'm a blatant overthinker.
Well, I'm your polar opposite for a start, James, being an ESFJ. So I would have to be careful probably about the kind of language I use for a start to open up any question.
So you wouldn't ask me how I feel?
Probably not, no. I don't think that would go down too well, do you?
No, not at all. So what, you'd phrase things based on what my dominant function would be or my auxiliary function? Well,
I would, and obviously I'd be working probably on your introverted thinking, because that would be your dominant function. And certainly with respect to, say, something like your negative anima, that's likely to be hiding in there. Yes. And so I would be interested in that, probably, quite specifically, really.
That's true, actually. Yeah.
So do you recognise it as hiding in there, do you?
I do know.
Whether it does.
It's always a difficult thing to see, isn't it? But in the beginning, that was one of the first things both of you said about myself, was like, you think too much. Right. It's like, what does that mean?
Yes.
It's a weird thing, but it's like, that's where your negative anima is operating. And it's setting up all these weird choices for you, and you think you're being a smart boy when actually you're not. It's something else that's sort of driving that. Right. So I guess that's a general rule. Look at the dominant function. That's where the negative syzygy is hiding.
Yes. Obviously negative anima for a man and negative animus for a woman. And you need to know something about psychological type in order to know where it might be hiding. Yeah. Right. And because relating is such a, an important thing, isn't it? It's the stuff of life, really, relating, and that's certainly an important place to look. It's the go-to place, really, to find out what's really going on. And as we know, you might be the last, not you specifically, but whoever it is might be the last person to know that it's hiding in there and it's actually running the show. Yeah.
So, I guess in terms of pacing and leading me in a therapeutic process, or any introverted thinking type, you would pace it in the form of problems and logic, then, if I understand it correctly, in terms of how to get at me. So if you're saying that you wouldn't necessarily say, how are you feeling?
Yes.
Like you're the feeling type, you'd be like, so what do you think about this? Is that what you mean in that regard?
Well, yes. I mean, that's what I mean about the kind of language that you use.
Yeah.
Obviously, will be more familiar to you in terms of how you construct your reality. But it would go beyond just language as well, because it would be to do with obviously the kind of behaviour and that you emit, and the kinds of problems that you might bring into therapy with you. So it would be important to obviously see how that was playing out in your life, and how conscious or otherwise you were of that. So
yeah, I guess it's more difficult for myself to just generally answer the question, because the people who are signing up on, say, the consultation tiers tend to be of similar types to each other.
Yes, they do. Yes.
So you generally sort of approach it in the same way. So INTP, INTJ, INFJ, INFP, I think are the most common ones that we get.
Yes.
And it's like, for example, there's quite a lot of psychosomatic stuff. And I think, Steve, you were saying before that intuitive types tend to somaticize more than, say, sensing types.
Yes, they can do. I think your point about the types that you've just expressed, that would tend to be the kinds of types from the people who ask the questions. There's some difficulty with that, because I guess from my own style lends itself more to the practical application of things, whereas the guys who are asking these questions are typically looking for theoretical explanations, which are in and of themselves are absolutely fine, but that might not take you beyond a particular point. It's one thing to understand something conceptually, and it's very valuable to understand something conceptually, but the actual practical application of that is sometimes lost, I think, in overemphasising just a purely theoretical answer to something.
Okay.
So this is where it can be helpful for someone to give an example, or to say, well, this is a situation that I've found myself in, and how might I typically deal with that? But we tend not to get those kinds of questions for the reasons that you've said.
Yeah.
Which is no criticism of the questions we're getting by any means, but for us, our whole life has been about the clinical application of things.
Yeah, that's the difference between learning something for fun. I think lots of guys are interested in this stuff for fun, and learning something because either you're suffering or you want to really alleviate suffering in others. When you get to that point, it's like the fluff disappears.
Yes.
Sometimes things can be fun. Sometimes, a little bit of philosophy here and there.
Of course, it can, and it can be interesting to sort of play around with ideas and to sort of build theoretical models and so on. But at the end of the day, my take on it, and you might say, well, this is a feature of my type, and it probably is it's clinical, it's practical application to people and to everyday lives, and that would be my emphasis. So I'm aware I may not have answered it maybe in the way that this particular gentleman would like me to, but for me that's where it's at.
Okay. Yeah, so after this you don't want to go and discuss privately the ins and outs of complex theory and everything like that?
Well, it's not that it doesn't interest me, and it's not that I don't do that, but it has to deliver in some other way, otherwise what's the inherent value of it?
I agree.
Beyond that otherwise, so...
Yeah, this is good. Hope that helps, Nightchild. This question comes from 0 Point. Zero Point asks, does the aspect of Gestalt therapy regarding the drive to completion of unfinished issues make its way into a modern Jungian model? Or if not, how does this concept of nagging discomfort until the issue is done factor into a meta-model of effective psychological therapy, whether Jungian or otherwise?
Hi, thank you. That's a good question. Unfinished business, as I was familiar with it when I was learning about Gestalt therapy back in the 1970s. That's a very usable concept. It's user-friendly. People don't consider it to be theory-laden. It's something which you can hook into with respect to your everyday experience. With respect to Jung, unfinished business would have to do with the process of self-actualization and individuation as, if you like, a top layer of explanation. But anything that you accumulate to yourself through your life that has to do with a complex will produce the so-called nagging doubt. And beneath the layer of complexes, you can talk about archetypes if you wish, but beneath that again, you've got instinctive pressure as well, genomic pressure. The genome is on a timed release, and at different times of our life we are under instinctive pressure to actualise our genomic potential to adapt to whatever stage of development. Insofar as we may or may not adapt, we accrue a complex around that particular issue. And anything which is not finished then becomes unfinished business, and that then gives us this conscious sense of nagging doubt. So yeah, it's a good concept. It's user friendly. You can easily transpose that over into Jung without any difficulty at all. So yeah, no problem with that.
Alright, and this question comes from 0 Point, and he asks, when we think of the unconscious as a hard drive we can plug into and receive information from, are there any other useful models that directly map the psyche to the parts of a computer, or to the nature of computer programs? As someone with a background studying computer programming and now learning about psychotherapy and hypnosis, there is an uncanny feeling of parity between the fields. I'm curious which books, lectures, teachers or fields go into this in a way that is most contiguous with the Jungian map of the psyche. What do you think, Steve?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. You're obviously going to be familiar with cognitive neuroscience. I wonder if you're as familiar with affective neuroscience, that's emotional neuroscience, which the teacher who's most closely associated with that is the late Jack Panksepp. That's Jack as J-A-A-K, Panksepp. Most of the cutting edge of development at the moment within psychodynamics and science and information processing is moving away from the hard cognitive computer modelling into the so-called affective neurosciences, and specifically into a field called neuropsychoanalysis. And this is very different, very, very different, but I would highly recommend you check their work out. So the leading figures are Eric Goodwin, The Neurobiology of the Gods, Jack Panksepp, anything you can get on him, Mark Solms, that's S-O-L-M-S, who is one of the founders of the neuropsychoanalytic movement, and then John Ryan Hewell, it's spelled H-A-U-L-E. He is a Jungian analyst who has written extensively on the crossover with neuroscience, including affective neuroscience. And generally all of these writers are critical of a computer modelling base for information processing with respect to Jung's model. I'm sure that you're happy where you're at because of your background with respect to cognitive neuroscience and its capacity to work with, if you like, the development of Jungian theory, but I would highly recommend you look at affective neuroscience and where neuropsychoanalysis is going.
Just for fun, I was thinking about it as you were speaking there. Biopsychosocial hardware software network.
Yeah,
because they sort of network with each other. But in terms of, if you're talking about a Jungian model, it's like what complexes, and you want shadow and anima, animus, and self or genomic self. It's like I can't think of anything that can actually work in that regard in terms of software. That's going to be the level of the psyche. It doesn't really make any sense unless someone else who's a computer programmer is getting very excited by this, wants to comment down below what they think. Maybe they know about the BIOS and stuff like that. No idea. Could be good fun to think about, but probably not useful.
No, probably not. If you get into neuroscience properly, and I've been using a term a lot recently to my colleagues, a neurophobic complex. A lot of Jungians are neurophobic. They want to keep away from any idea that the brain has any function at all. That's clearly just nonsense.
Surely that is the silliest thing in the universe.
It is, absolutely, I'm afraid, but they are like that. Whereas the neuropsychoanalysts are actually mapping psychodynamic structures onto the brain, not just the cortex but also the limbic system, and the so-called 7 basic emotional systems that were identified by Jack Panksepp. So yeah, have a look at that. It might just change your perspective a little in a very healthy direction. And just on the subject of neuroscience, please don't, I'm sure you don't, go on about left brain, right brain nonsense. It's a pile of pop psychology crap. Just put it in the bin. And don't listen to anybody who talks like that. It's nonsense. Honestly, go to the real neuroscientists.
I agree with that.
Cheers, my friend. Thank you.
All right, and this question comes from 0 Point. And he asks, in a more of a spiritual life coaching or shamanic viewpoint, there is the concept that pain travels through families until someone is ready to face it. How did Jung, and how do you, view the impact and implication of generational patterns of similar psychological drama? Or in other words, what is the deeper construct at play when, for example, a father who was not recognised by his own family, for who he is represses the pain of that, and then raises his own son in a similar way? That was sort of caught on. In the life coaching or shamanic world, there seems to be a very celebratory stance on being the one to face the pain and end the cycle for the generations. And from a lived experience perspective, this feels true to me, having gone towards that outcome. But I'm curious if or how this concept is reified in the psychoanalytic literature. Thanks. Well, thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very complicated and deep question. Initially, I would say that Jungians would approach it from what Jung called the family constellation, that is to say the family complex. That's the cultural transmission transgenerationally of issues that have occurred before and are passed on from the parents typically to the children and so on. I've actually been involved in transgenerational familial family therapy where we've used enactments to uncouple things that have probably been laid down several hundred years before in terms of even the awareness of the information that was being passed down through the family. That's actually a common thing to experience. So there is a cultural transmission that can be dealt with as a collective or a family complex, and Jung did write extensively about that in volume 2 of his collected works, Experimental Researches. He carried out word association tests and even found that people had similar physiological responses to the same concepts that were being passed on and down through families. Then of course there's the epigenetic potential, which I'm sure James will comment upon, which will have a factor as well. As for being the one who stands up and says enough is enough, yes, I've been involved in that in therapy. It is a heroic thing to do, to say that it stops. For example, with respect to personal disclosure, I was beaten by my father. He was beaten by his mother rather than his father, heavily with a frying pan by all accounts.
Jeez.
And he decided to pass that on to me, and I decided that it stopped. And I have never, ever physically harmed, hit, or any other such way my own children. I never would. As far as I was concerned, it was stopping there and then. And in terms of family complexes, individuals are doing this all the time. When they realise what's been done to them and they disidentify with the culture of the family, which is passing on this transgenerational material, and they stand up and say no, very often they have to make a stand against the parents or even the grandparents, sometimes the great-grandparents, and therefore the influences upon the great-grandparents. So you can see these things do or can pass down almost directly from 150 years right into the consulting room of today and the family of today. So yeah, people can make a heroic stance, and I think that they should. With respect to the shamanistic tradition, well, that's one way of doing it, and it can be effective. We choose our way of dealing with things, and at the moment there's a lot of people moving in that direction. It was something else before, and it'll be something else again, but the deep structure remains the same regardless of the approach that's used on the surface. And I think that's the value of Jung in this instance, that he was able to teach us how all of these different surface structure methods of dealing with things and understanding things across cultures do bottom out with basically the same thing. And effective neuroscience and neuropsychoanalysis is confirming this right now. So the deep structure is more important to me than the surface structure. I'll always go to that first, and then look at the context of the individual, and then see what is the appropriate surface structure intervention for that person to reach the deep structure. And sometimes if you go directly to the deep structure, you can cut out a lot of stuff. And I'll give you an example. It's not popular amongst internet followers of Jung, and that is that archetypes very often distract rather than reveal, and that if you can get down to the level of instincts, you can blow away complexes very, very easily, and in the process archetypes just disappear because the reason for them being there as images just goes away. You don't have to be distracted by them. Instincts reflect directly genomic pressure and intentionality with respect to lifespan development. And people who've been over-educated but under-experienced in life tend to fall for the idea of archetypes very, very easily. They're very suggestible to anything which represents an idea, and the more inflated the idea, the better. And that's one reason why they avoid instincts, because instincts seem so unconscious and so mechanistic, so animalistic and non-human, that as if they're not worthy of intellectual attention. But that's the whole point. When you go through emotions, affective neuroscience, the limbic system, rather than the distraction of the cortex, you get down to instincts very quickly, and from them you get down into the genome very quickly. You can solve problems very, very quickly. So there's the deep structure. The value of ritual, when it's done properly, in an indigenous culture that has nurtured such things for centuries or even thousands of years, is that they use those shamanistic methods, or even religious methods of a more conventional kind, to transduce the information from the genome through instinct into a representational form that is usually interpersonal and social, and allows an acting out and a transformation, both ways, of information to bring about therapeutic change. And that's what I meant by the surface structure and the deep structure interacting through some process. For example, I use enactments, and that's a kind of ritual. But we don't impose a structure with respect to, say, a shamanistic perspective or a religious perspective. We just provide the opportunity for the psyche to do what it wants naturally, and then the healing process emerges. And that's a topic again for another podcast. If people want to know what works and why what works, then they need to approach the psyche in a naturalistic way as far as is possible. But some cultures do nurture particular surface structures as mechanisms and vehicles for accessing deep structure. That can be shamanism. And I'm calling it surface structure, but most Westerners would think of it as being deep structure, mainly because it's different to what they experience. But there are many, many ways of getting down to the depths of the psyche. And shamanism is cultural. It might be culturally specific. It might be attractive because it's different. Just as in the 60s, people were drawn to India. India was the font of all wisdom, and it is of a lot of wisdom. But many Westerners who went with the Beatles out to India, a lot of the hippies of my generation that went out there, ended up trying to tack on things that did not take because they were not of that culture. They didn't have it sufficiently into their genome even for it to take in an authentic way. The best way to solve that conundrum is to ask the psyche to give you, the ego consciousness, what it wants to give you in the form that it thinks will help, and then you'll get all the information that you need. So from my perspective, that's what I do. Naturalistic approach to the psyche. You get to the deep structures very, very quickly then.
Yeah, I like that, and it's just a little comment on your you mentioning about archetypal images distract. I understand, because we've been critiqued as a team many times for saying such things, and I kind of understand it where people are coming from, because it makes life more interesting. The archetypal images. I love the image of the night and stuff like that. You see that the thumbnails that I make for these videos, they have a particular style, and my dreams will produce these, and active imagination will produce these things. But this is the importance of grounding it in biology so much. It's like, if you believe in evolution, you know, which is kind of a silly thing to even say, but take like Charles Darwin, for example. If he was right, if you take that as a principle, then human beings are a part of the animal kingdom, and therefore we're not separate to the other animals in terms of lifespan development. And that blows away the archetypal images thing immediately. Yeah. You know, it's like, in a clinical setting, that's all that could ever work. But you mentioned epigenetics earlier, and how this through epigenetics. It could be epigenetics, it could be transposons, not entirely, or multiple different models. We were talking in an earlier question today that complexes can be spread by a psycho or socially.
Yeah.
So the normal one that you'd think would be psychological complex. You receive some kind of trauma, for example, and it affects you in some way. Or there's an influence from your mum or your dad, and you have a complex that forms in that particular way.
Yeah.
But why not? Why couldn't it be passed biologically?
Yeah.
It can be passed socially. It can be passed psychologically. Why not?
Indeed. Yes,
So
indeed.
I don't know what the mechanism for that is, but if a very, very wealthy investor wants to give me a biology lab, we can get started immediately.
Yeah.
And that'd be nice.
It will be good. It will be good.
Alright, and this question comes from Mooseman. He
Mooseman.
asks, did Carl Jung believe in evolution, or did he believe in the Christian myth of Adam and Eve as the creation of man? I'll let you take this to start with.
Well, both. And as James has mentioned before, that's a paradox and a potential neurosis, because it's a division that is so fundamental. You would have to have a deeper structure than either of those to link them together and maintain an ordinary orientation to life consciously, because otherwise you would be in permanent conflict with yourself. So that there has to be some way of bridging those two things together. In Carl Jung's case, that will be his personal myth. If you have access to that, in the sense that you understand it and what fed into it, you will be at peace with that division in Carl Jung, and you won't feel inclined particularly to criticise him for being divided. You may disagree with either one of those two poles, but you would understand the fact that he had both. I would say that if you actually cornered him, if that were even possible, if you could corner him, he would protest that he was scientific and that therefore he believed in evolution. But then he would look at the psyche as an evolutionary factor within which there were archetypes, as he called them, and therefore the archetypal images that express them. And then there is the individual's way of understanding that through his own personal myth. And very often what passes as a personal myth is in fact a collective myth. It's something which is ingested from the environment, through culture, and that's fine if you can live your life by that, but you will not individuate through a collective myth. You can't, because you don't become an individual, you become part of a collective, and your psyche remains at that level. If you're going to individuate through the notion of a personal myth, then you have to take on everything that you believe in ruthlessly. You have to pressure test it to breaking point and see what's left standing at the end. And if you can then knit that together, you do have a genuine personal myth which is individual to you. I believe, for what that's worth, bearing in mind that belief proves nothing, as Jung said, other than the phenomenon of belief, what I believe is that Carl Jung did manage that. He pulled that off in his own life, which is why he never really particularly felt obliged to explain himself in any definitive way about what he believed. So for him, Darwin, and Jesus, no problem. And in your own life, you'll be obliged, as we all are, if we are introspective and want to find or make some kind of meaning for ourselves, to go through a similar process. But similar is not the same. If you merely try to copy Carl Jung, you will fail to become an individual, for all sorts of psychological and psychodynamic reasons. So don't do it. Be inspired by him, admire him, but become yourself.
For anyone who doesn't know about the Adam and Eve thing, because I realised we actually just sort of jumped, we kind of presume what a psychological model might be acted out through like narrative form. To take from Neumann for a moment, because Neumann was a student of Jung's, and he wrote his book Origins and History of Consciousness quite late in Jung's life, and Jung said it was the book he wished he'd written, and so therefore that's a safe case to make. I mean, there's a general case in that book that the development of the ego over an individual's lifespan matches the development of mankind as such. So phylogeny and ontogeny sort of match each other together. So the evolutionary process would be like, okay, we started off without an ego, and then the ego evolved. And then an ego of an individual forms after the individual psyche is formed, is the argument in that book. And so therefore, from the perspective of the ego, how does it explain what happened to itself before it was formed? It's like, well, it looks back and it fills in the gaps. And so that's what that book is all about. But Anthony Stevens has come along and debunked that. He called
Yeah.
it a great book,
Yeah.
but a misguided book.
Yeah.
And it's now known that those things are not true.
Yeah.
That phylogeny and ontogeny do not match each other. So, the Adam and Eve thing is kind of like, okay, well, one day we became aware of things and we became aware of mortality as the ego fell, and this is paradise lost and Satan falling from heaven, and it's like, fun story, makes sense, clinically utterly useless.
Yeah, it is.
So therefore, obviously we're talking about practical stuff on this channel.
Yeah, yeah. It is useless, except in those cases, of course, James, and I know that you understand and appreciate this, where someone comes in with a specific religious structure to their belief, in which case, of course, you just work with that and you accept it for what it is. In terms of it meaning anything beyond that, though, yes, it would be.
In terms of like a tool in your suite of tools, it's like, that's what we were talking about earlier with like these archetypal images and these stories. It's like you wouldn't use them to treat somebody, but they can be good fun. I'm not going to lie, they can be good fun.
You can certainly utilise what people come in with. My concern is where I have seen this so often, that it becomes what Alfred Adler called a guiding fiction or a neurotic alibi, beneath which there is private logic, beneath which is a neurosis, a maladaptation. And this is the kind of layering that you see clinically that people who are mainly focused on their own personal development don't get to see, because they can't stand outside of themselves objectively enough. And that's understandable, and that's perfectly reasonable. You're on your own journey, you're not trying to work with other people and their problems. But as soon as you do, your perspective on yourself will change. You will see different things. And one thing about, in support of what James was saying about the way that the ego tries to understand itself, there is such a thing as internal projection from the ego. And that's an example of it, because ego consciousness knows only itself. The unconscious is something completely different, really is completely different. We should have a naturalistic perspective with respect to the unconscious and allow it to express itself. We should not project internally a model of the ego into the darkness of the unconscious, because all we're going to do then is see ourselves. We'll see perhaps an enlarged version of the ego, and we might then call that the self in a Jungian sense, mistakenly believing that the concept from Jung is what we're experiencing, rather than it just being an ego fiction, just being an illusion. You won't get any further personal development by doing that. You'll certainly amuse and occupy yourself and waste some time, and it might even distract you from stress or whatever. In that sense, it's useful, but you're not getting to the truth that way by projecting internally. And when we train depth psychologists and psychotherapists, this is one of the hard lessons they have to learn, that you must avoid doing that. And the minute that you stop doing that, the unconscious will present in its natural form to you, and that's completely different. Very, very different experience. So you have to set all theory aside, and Jung himself said that. He offered the theory on the basis of his experience, and then said very wisely, set it aside. But how many people actually do that? They don't. They start to look for definite things. And once you've learned something, that becomes part of your ego consciousness, part of your self-concept, because you identify with the theory. That theory then is internally projected. And if people think, well, projection's unconscious, so surely that can't be the case. The ego has its own unconsciousness, which are its tacit and implicit beliefs, which it has acquired and will not critically test. And they are, if you like, the things that are projected most easily internally in an effort to understand the inner world. The minute you stop doing that, and I know this for a fact, when I train people as well, and they experience it, it's life-changing for them, because the unconscious tells them what the unconscious is at that point. It communicates openly. When you set all theory aside, that's the way to go.
And this question comes from Blessed by the Gull, and he or she, pretty sure he actually, says, this question is probably more directed towards Steve and Pauline. Unfortunately, I am the new Steve, so it's going to be Pauline and James. How would you go about treating addiction in someone today using the IPSA and the biopsychosocial model? Any stories to share? I think it would be an interesting comparison between the biopsychosocial way of treating addiction and other treatments used today. And to be honest, I think it could be helpful for us to know about the methods you use so that we can try to treat the addictions we might develop in the future or even have today. That's an enormous question, so I will give you the privilege of starting.
Thank you, James.
With that.
Well, in the context of the biopsychosocial model, I would start with biology every time. You have to work bottom up because nothing else will take if you don't do that and you don't address things at that level. So we're back to the level of instincts again, probably, with respect to addiction and what is driving that addiction and what it might... It depends on the addiction, of course, as well, the type of addiction. But the thing that seems to drive most addictions, if I broaden it out, is people not registering, and we've talked about these things before in other podcasts, or not being satiated properly. And it just depends what that means in any individual context. So people need to, obviously, if they're... reflecting on this themselves, obviously they have to look at their own context and look at what instincts might be being frustrated. And you know, people go on all sorts of binges and rampages, don't they, with drink and drugs and bad relationships and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And that it's important to find out what stands behind that. And what is driving that addiction. And like I said, I think the only way to do that is to come back to instincts every time and find out what instincts are being frustrated in that person's life, because they won't... thing about instincts is that they want you to take notice. They don't... they're not going to let up until you acknowledge them. They're so fundamental to our being and our well-being that they have to be addressed.
Yeah, the Blessed by the Goal says something interesting. It's like, what's the difference between, say, the IPSA way versus sort of the modern way? And I guess theoretically, the modern way, if you like, is everything is chemically based and solely chemically based.
Yes.
So like if you're addicted to cigarettes, it's because of nicotine. And
yes.
then if you try and go cold turkey, it's going to be like 3 weeks of absolute pain.
Yes.
And then you will quit. Or alcohol, well, it's because of chemical stuff. Or cocaine is chemical stuff. Or heroin is chemical stuff. And it's like, yeah, there will, for biopsychosocial, there will be a chemical or biochemical basis. But it blends with that psychological layer as well, and that social layer too, right?
It does.
So I know that Steve's talked about on the channel before about, has talked about on the channel before about treating cigarette addiction and alcohol addiction with hypnosis. So, well, how do you square that? Where are the massive withdrawal symptoms with that? Yes. You know, it's like Alan Carr's easy way to stop smoking is this hypnotic piece of work. And people will go to his clinics, or they did, because he's deceased now, go to his clinics, and then they come away completely quit, no withdrawals. It's like, how would you explain that without a biopsychosocial approach? You know, I'm not quite sure how anything else could make sense. But to direct people as well, we did a 3-part series a few months ago on addiction, and I'll leave a link to that playlist in the description down below. The first video, unfortunately, is blocked in America because of some music that we use. There's like a copyright claim. Right. So if you're in the US, go to the second video, and in the description there's a link that sends you to BitChute to watch the first one. I know people have mentioned messages before about that.
Yes.
So yeah. Is there anything else we could say on that? Is there anything else you wanted to say on this question?
Well, people sometimes, I think, like I said before, don't realise how important instincts are. And it's, it's probably important to be able to define maybe what some of those driving forces are.
Yeah.
I mean, the obvious one, as of now, of course, it is the way people are being frustrated through lockdown. Again, we've touched on these kinds of things before. The way people feel trapped in their own homes, the way they feel caged almost, We've talked about animal experimentation and how badly animals respond to being caged, and how it affects all those fundamental biological systems, such as appetite and the need for rest, for sleep. The normal reproductive cycles become disrupted. There's so many biological levels at which a person becomes affected if they feel trapped or caged in some way, because instinctively you know that it's not right to live like that. And we've got obviously another impending lockdown coming up, and I think people are reacting to that very, very badly, actually, and understandably so, because it's contra naturam. It's not right for people to be caged in their homes in the way that they are. And again, we've touched on this in other podcasts about the way that people are likely to respond to this, and I think they're likely increasingly to respond to it in a violent way, in an aggressive way, because there'll be a need for to be able to assert those instincts in a way that has health for that person, and if it means resorting to aggression and violence, I'm not advocating that, but you can understand that it will push people in that direction. And we're certainly seeing, for example, an awful lot of suicides in young men particularly at the moment, almost an alarming amount of suicides. In fact, one of our son's close childhood friends has recently committed suicide. It's an absolute tragedy on what is becoming an increasingly large scale as well. We're literally seeing it day in and day out. Young people, young men in particular, who are just deciding enough is enough and taking themselves out. It's almost as if that's the only way they have left of asserting themselves. And it's a very, very sad situation indeed. But I think it will be, if nothing else, interesting to see how people react to this, forthcoming lockdown. I mean, at the moment it's a bit of a kind of a halfway stage, but there is talk, for example, even of bringing the army in. And once those kinds of things happen, people are going to get increasingly angry and frustrated, because, like I say, it's contra natural natural to be, forced to live in that way. So then you see the instincts very much in the raw when this kind of thing happens, and you see the importance of them and how they insist themselves and want to be taken notice of. So it's a very relevant example for now, I think, of the kind of things that people are battling with. And obviously people will have things within their own personal context as well as the wider culture that they may be reacting to very badly as well. So, they're at the bottom of everything. Yeah. They really are.
Yeah. We did a contest a while ago on the Discord server about how the anima operates at different levels of the biopsychosocial stack. Indeed, and what you just explained with that sad story, and indeed with this increasing violence or potential for violence.
There is the potential for it.
The anima is going to operate at those levels too. The political system, the economic system, and everything like that. It's like, so to answer, blessed by the goal again in that way. It's kind of like, all of these things will factor into an individual at the intersection of like space and time, moment to moment, constantly. So it's like, it's not quite as simple as, I have a chemical addiction.
No, absolutely not, because we live in a wider context, as you rightly say, James, whereby we can't escape the culture that we live in and that we grow up in, and so that has to be taken into account. But we also have to understand too that we have a biology. We at bottom we are animals. We're human animals, but we are animals. And you can't book biology without creating huge problems for yourself. So things do need to be addressed at every level, but always start with biology, then look at the social situation and the cultural context for that person and how they interface with that, and what influences might be coming from the culture at large, and then finally psychology, so I'd come to that last. Yeah, what I would probably add to that, James, is that people obviously are going to almost be forced to turn to substances, to substance abuse, in order to deal with some of those frustrations as well. How else do people who, and there are people in so many different contexts. There'd be people who, older people who are living alone, or people who've been recently bereaved, people who have lost their jobs. There are so much fallout socioculturally from the situation that we find ourselves in. So we'll probably see a spike, if anything, in people turning towards substances to deal with the stresses that they're under, and understandably so. But I think a knowledge and understanding of that instinctive pressure, for some people, might even just allow them to bring themselves back from the brink before they maybe find themselves engaging in those options. But just, it's completely understandable that people will be drawn to those kinds of things, just to try and ease their way through what is a very unnatural situation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and this question comes from Mooseman. And Mooseman asks, short and simple, can complexes live on after an individual has died, either by natural causes or by suicide?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I know James has a particular view on this, which is interesting and illustrates the biopsychosocial model very well. James?
Yeah, we were just discussing before this. If you think I was thinking of Dawkins' selfish gene model and what he says about altruism. It's kind of a weird thing, because why would an individual sacrifice themselves for another individual? Because surely your own genome wants to survive. But the whole idea with that model is you sacrifice yourself for people who have a similar genome to you, so that the similar genes, or the genes that you share, live on. So if you think about that in terms of like a biopsychosocial model and how things can bleed from one individual to another, then a complex that manifests psychosocially can, if the individual dies, spread on to that other person and continue living through them. So it's just a different reframe. It's like, if an organism dies, surely a complex can't continue living on in the biology, but it can in like the social sphere.
Yes, it can, absolutely. And of course, with a shared complex, such as a family complex or any systems level above an individual with respect to the biopsychosocial model, as it's all down to influence and suggestion and then taking root, it can actually infect, as James mentioned actually earlier off camera, it can affect other people biologically or psychobiologically as well. So once these things start, they can metastasize and spread around all over the place. So for an individual it might die off, but that influence with and between others who were in the influential sphere of the original person, yeah, definitely can live on, albeit not in that individual.
This question comes from UnderSolstice93, otherwise known as Jake. Jake says, hi James, Steve and Pauline. I have a question relating to imposter syndrome. Do you come across this a lot in your clinical practice? Is it a complex manifesting itself, or is it due to a fragile ego? How might I overcome the feeling of being an imposter while I progress through a career, and specifically at university? And he follows up by saying, just to add further to my question above, with the feeling of being an imposter in relation to my work, to be more specific, I work in frontline healthcare and a mature student studying biomedical science at university. Good choices, by the way. Be due to suppressed instincts. I ask this as I continue to grapple with the material already out there on the Discord and the YouTube channel, and I'm trying to make sense of all of the previous discussions. Sorry if this is a repeated question. Not at all, Jake. We've discussed imposter syndrome once or twice on the channel before, but usually just in passing. But I guess I will pass over to you, Pauline.
Well, I'm not so sure it exists, James, to be honest with you. I think it's almost been manufactured by the culture to simply describe maybe the way that somebody feels about themselves. I mean, I would almost be more drawn to Adler's ideas, for example, of inferiority and superiority complexes and how they play out in people's lives. And, you know, I think it's probably a more helpful direction to come from as well, because people for example, who have a superiority complex, they will compensate for that by behaving in an inferior way. So sometimes it's just that a person's not really living up to their genomic potential. And I think to think of it as being an imposter syndrome is such a negative suggestion, isn't it? And self-suggestion to make.
It is. I'm an imposter. And
Yes.
also I've got a syndrome as well.
Yes,
Especially when
yes.
a syndrome, when you look into a syndrome, it's not a real thing insofar as it's like cause and effect. It's just a series of symptoms that just seem to manifest together.
That's right, a bit of a catch-all, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
I've just looked it up on Google there for the the strict definition of
Yes.
this. Imposter syndrome is a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their accomplishments or talents and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. And it's like, is that really what people mean when they feel they have imposter syndrome?
Well, that's a very good point, isn't it? I mean, sometimes people will feel and express that self-doubt, maybe through other complexes that are acting on them negatively. They could be parental complexes, internalised parental complexes. They could be a whole host of things. But I don't believe in and of itself it's a helpful way to think about things or to frame things. It may simply be that that it's been suggested to that person that they can't do X, Y and Z, or they're not particularly good at X, Y and Z, and actually another part of them doesn't really believe that, and then of course they become divided on the inside. They feel that split within themselves between the activity of the complexes, which are the rhetoric of the complexes, if you like, and what they actually know to be true about themselves, and so they kind of fall down between two stools. But it may simply be that person not living up to their genomic potential, or feeling almost embarrassed to do that. And if that's happening, that's really very sad, isn't it? Because
It is.
At the end of the day, that's what we should all be working towards, to be ourselves as completely as we can be.
Yeah.
So I worry about it. I mean, I've heard so many particularly young people say it about themselves, but I think a lot of it is just it seems to have come out of the culture, and obviously it's grabbed a lot of young people's attention, and it's so easy to Google these things these days, and to see yourself in the material that you read. And I would just say be very, very careful, and it's probably more likely actually that you're just not living up to your potential, and there are some negative complexes at work that are maybe trying to prevent you from doing that. But becoming conscious of that is probably enough of a start to be able to overcome them. So I personally would ditch it. I'd bin it. I don't think it's helpful at all.
Completely agree. I'm going to use a famous Steve quote from the channel. Go back to instincts.
Yes.
It's like if you feel you've got imposter syndrome, and you can do this on yourself relatively safely. It's like we've given the IPSA students actual forms to do this, officially or formally. But anyone can do it. So what are your biopsychosocial parameters that are at work? And see which instincts of yours may be not being expressed or may be suppressed. It's like I've worked with guys and girls actually who've signed up to the consultations here on Patreon, saying that they've got imposter syndrome. And it's like, I remember one girl I worked with, the issue was actually with her family. And a guy that I've worked with, or pretty much all the guys I've worked with it, are issues involving status. And of course, Jake, this has to be bespoke to yourself, so I wouldn't necessarily go looking in those places. But it goes to show that you present with a syndrome, which is like a CBT buzzword that you've read online.
Yes.
It's actually a completely different thing that goes back down into the instincts. And it's like, I guess that's one of our core things we talk about on the channel.
Yes, it is. Yes, absolutely it is. Yeah, get back in touch with instincts, and everything else will correct for itself without a doubt. Yeah, but you have to try and work out for yourself in your own particular context what instincts might be, not being expressed properly or frustrated in some way. It's not a difficult thing to do, but I think it's a more productive thing to do than to simply give yourself such a nebulous label as well, isn't it, really? Like we said before, it's such a catch-all. I think you have to be very, very careful.
Yeah, agreed.